Welcome to History Happy Hour. I'm your host, Jess Edberg, Executive Director of the Dorothy Molter Museum. The purpose of this program is to educate, inspire, and entertain with a pint-sized historical tale related to the Ely area history in about the time it takes to drink a glass of your favorite beverage. Let me qualify this program by saying the history I share is not a deep dive, rather, it scratches the surface using publicly accessible resources, including online content, in-person interviews, and published materials. Additionally, this program is offered as a free in-person half-hour event October through May, typically on the third Wednesday of the month at 5 p.m. at the Boathouse Brewpub and Restaurant in Ely, Minnesota. History Happy Hour is supported in kind by the Boathouse Brewpub, Ely's Heritage Preservation Commission, the Dorothy Molter Museum, Boundary Waters Connect, the Ely Folk School, and Ely Trivia Night. And seasons 2023 to 24 programs are now live as podcasts via buzzsprout.com, as well as on Apple, Amazon, and Spotify podcast platforms. So, why do we have a whole month dedicated to women's history? I'm not asking you, I know why, but I want you to think about why there's a Women's History Month throughout this program. Like many of the topics I choose for this program, there are overlapping historical moments that make creating an origin story timeline a bit muddy. This one is no different. Like-minded people around the world were coming to the same conclusion about the conditions of life for women. Female trade workers were fed up with unsafe working conditions that seemed to be escalating with expansion and industrialization around the world. They were excluded from decision-making outside of the home, being pushed aside, ignored, and abused regularly and repeatedly almost everywhere. Here in the US, protests by working women were erupting and making the news as early as 1857 with a textile workers' strike in New York. Women were working 16-hour days compared to their male counterparts and making pennies on the dollar. Sound familiar? The oppression and inequality of women spurred women to become more vocal and active in campaigning for equality and to organize. Here in Ely, the women's suffrage movement began in 1889 with the Vesey Temperance Society at the Opera House. Senya Mackey, who will come back a bit later, told her grandson, David Kess, that she and her friend Anna Lino saw at least one suffrage parade in downtown Ely besides whatever lectures or programs that were held at the Opera House. Not surprisingly, no mention of these activities or any parade was seen in the local papers. As time passed, little progress was made, and women here and abroad got frustrated. The British Women's Social and Political Union formed in 1903, led by Emmeline Pankhurst, and gave strength to the women's equal rights movement through organizing. This group was and still is referred to as a, quote, militant group due to their penchant for violence. The women in the Union were the first to be deemed suffragettes. The title came from the term suffragist, which was peaceful protest of women's suffrage. The definition of a suffragette is a woman who is fighting for a right to vote with organized protest. However, these protests were often violent and considered anything but peaceful. The suffragettes started fires, vandalized political buildings, and caused an uproar during voting periods. They were also sexually assaulted and restrained by the police. The strikes did not stop with imprisonment. However, once in prison, the suffragettes would often refuse to eat, and the guards would then force feed the women. It took almost 50 years in the United States, but in 1908, 15,000 women marched in New York City, again demanding shorter hours, better pay, and voting rights. And the next year, more protests erupted. Although some countries like New Zealand, Australia, and the Isle of Man gave women the right to vote before the end of the 19th century, it was a long, drawn-out process for much of the industrialized world. So women's voices got louder, asking for the same rights, privileges, and access to opportunities as their male counterparts. At this time, and for decades later, women in the United States couldn't vote, get adequate medical care, wear certain clothes, attend university, own property, access legal representation, and were excluded from public areas, for example. The right to vote meant women could contribute to decisions being made that directly affected them, because at that time, all political decisions were being made by men, even those that only affected women. Inspired by the marches in New York, the Socialist Party of America played a key role in organizing the first National Women's Day in 1909, which later evolved into International Women's Day on March 8th. The concept of a day to recognize women's rights and contributions to society and support women's equality began both here and abroad. And the following year, German socialists and activists Louise Zietz and Clara Zetkin proposed to declare International Women's Day at the Second International Conference of Socialist Women in Copenhagen. Although they did not name an official date, Zetkin suggested that every country should have a day that symbolizes the struggle for women's rights. This event mobilized over 100 working European women from 17 countries, representing unions, socialist parties, working women's clubs, and including the first 3 women elected to the Finnish parliament. And as a result, 114 years ago today, the first International Women's Day was celebrated on March 19th, 1911. Clara Zetkin was active in the Social Democratic Party in Germany and was eventually exiled to Paris. She believed that the working class women's fight was not the same as the bougie upper and middle classes and pushed women to get out of the house and into work so that they could participate in trade unions and other workers' rights organizations to improve conditions for themselves from the inside. Of course, Zetkin was also a big proponent of the early Communist Party in Europe, but not the Cold War communism most people today think of that typically signifies a centralized authoritarian situation with a completely classless society and no personal property. Zetkin worked toward a socialist communism, encompassing a broader spectrum of ideas with democratic processes and elections, communal wealth generation, and social services like universal health care. This type of social communism was achieved in Russia through Zetkin's collaboration with Lenin, and then Stalin took over in 1924. When World War I was imminent in 1913, Zetkin spoke at the International Women's Peace Conference, gathering support to protest the war with her passionate speech on the evils of the ruthless capitalism of war, leaving nothing to gain and all to lose for the workers. Following discussions, International Women's Day was agreed to be marked annually on March 8th and has remained the global date for International Women's Day ever since. As the war progressed, the women's suffrage movement evolved, with more women taking on roles that they had previously been excluded from due to men being fighting in the war. This brought awareness to the role that women could have in society and that they could do man's work too. In 1917, on the last Sunday of February, Russian women began a strike for bread and peace in response to the death of over 2 million Russian soldiers in World War I. This ultimately triggered the February Revolution. Opposed by political leaders, the women continued to strike until 4 days later, when Tsar Nicholas II of the Romanov dynasty was forced to abdicate and the provisional government, with Lenin, granted women the right to vote. The date of the women's strike commenced was Sunday, February 23rd on the Julian calendar, then in use in Russia. This day on the Gregorian calendar, March 8th, the newly minted International Women's Day. Shortly after the end of World War I, women's suffrage became a reality in the United States with 19th Amendment in 1920. Let's also acknowledge that although this movement was worldwide, here in the US, this movement was only afforded to the white women. Black American women had also been fighting for voting rights since the 15th Amendment was ratified during Reconstruction in 1870. It prohibited the denial of the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude for men. However, Jim Crow laws, overt racism, and voter suppression was absolutely keeping Black and brown men from voting for quite a while. Decades of activism followed fighting for women, all women, to receive the basic rights afforded to white men. Finally, the 1950s saw the start of massive changes in society's views towards equality. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were the two most significant pieces of civil rights legislation since Reconstruction, and between the two, these acts outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. But these acts didn't make it illegal to discriminate against a woman in the workplace, in schools, or the doctor's office. However, in the early 1970s, several laws were passed with bipartisan support, and court decisions set precedents for women's rights. In 1972, Title IX ensured that female students and employees are treated fairly and equally without fear of harassment or violence in educational institutions. What does that look like? Meet Virginia Shepard. Shepard attended Ely Memorial High School and was a swimmer on the non-school sanctioned girls synchronized swimming team. In her freshman year, her coach convinced the school to let the girls travel to the Twin Cities to compete in a collegiate tournament where they won the championship. At her 1959 senior banquet, she received a varsity letter for her role in that tournament. She was the first girl to receive such an athletic honor, and since there were no letters for girls' sports, it was a patch of a male diver. Later, her coach called her in and said that someone complained to the school board about a girl being honored for athletics, and she would have to give the letter back. Shepard gave a hard no and kept it. Her story has since become a family legacy about doing what's right. That same year, the Equal Rights Amendment, ERA, was introduced and intended to protect women from sexual discrimination. It was to be ratified at the state level, and sadly, we are still trying to get enough states on board. More on that in a minute. The Supreme Court cases of Roe v. Wade and Eisenstadt v. Baird ruled that for women's right to choose and gave unmarried women access to birth control. However, the fight for equality hit pushback, and bipartisan support for women's equality began to waver. The word feminism was starting to be a dirty word. Enter conservative leader Phyllis Schlafly, who equated Catholicism with Americanism. Came on the scene like a freight train championing what today may be referred to as, quote, traditional family values, where women stay home and men make the decisions, as well as limiting federal support programs, effectively killing the ERA by making its issues partisan. Up until then, equal rights for all had brought both political parties together. All the while, International Women's Day was being celebrated. In 1975, the United Nations designated 1975 as International Women's Year and officially began celebrating International Women's Day. In 1978, Sonoma County, California created an education task force to improve the representation of women in history by holding a Women's History Week at schools. Their program caught national attention of state departments of education, seeing celebrations of National Women's History Week as an effective means to achieving equity goals within classrooms. Within a few years, thousands of schools and communities were celebrating National Women's History Week, supported and encouraged by resolutions from governors, city councils, school boards, and the U.S. Congress. Finally, President Jimmy Carter designated the first National Women's History Week in the U.S. in 1980. In the same year, House Representative Barbara Mikulski and Senator Orrin Hatch co-sponsored a congressional resolution for National Women's History Week in 1981. This co-sponsorship demonstrated the wide-ranging political support for recognizing, honoring, and celebrating the achievements of American women. Women's history observations snowballed from there. By 1986, 14 states recognized March as Women's History Month, and the next year, the U.S. Congress established Women's History Month as an annual, federally recognized observance. Each sitting U.S. president since 1995 has issued a yearly proclamation honoring the role of American women in history, even this year. But why a Women's History Month and not a Men's History Month? Other than what I've already presented you with, let's start with the fact that as recently as the 1970s, women's history was virtually an unknown topic in the K through 12 curriculum for school children, or barely a topic in the general public consciousness. The frustrating reality is that throughout human history, the stories, discoveries, invention, and roles of women have been omitted and sometimes appropriated. Men's contributions and experiences have traditionally been more prominently featured in historical narratives and education. Many societies have focused on male figures in history, making men's history already well documented and acknowledged. So now we as a society are righting that wrong by taking time to highlight those unknown, forgotten, stolen, or intentionally suppressed women's stories. For example, Indigenous women's stories. Marie Louise Bottineau Baldwin, a member of the Turtle Mountain Chippewa Band, was born in the Minnesota Territory in 1863. She attended high school in Minneapolis and was one of the first Native American women to get a law degree in the United States. She dedicated much of her life's work to Native American advocacy at the federal level from 1904 to 1932, including being active in the women's suffrage movement. Or African American women's stories, like Nellie Griswold Francis, an African American suffragist and civil rights pioneer in Minnesota. Born in 1874, she challenged the conventions of what an African American woman was permitted to achieve in early 20th century Minnesota. She was a churchwoman, clubwoman, suffragist, organizer, singer, civil rights worker, patriot, and wife to Minnesota's first African American diplomat, William T. Francis. Or Mary Gibbs, the first woman and the youngest person in the United States to be a park superintendent. At 24, she was stationed at Itasca State Park and faced down the big lumber companies, defying the threat of gun wielding lumberjacks to protect the old growth pine forests in Minnesota's first state park. Mrs. Carrie Christina Bystrom, who is credited as being the first immigrant woman in Tower, walked for 4 days from Duluth on foot on the Old Vermilion Trail to join her husband, who worked as a carpenter for the Minnesota Iron Company. Senya Mackey, previously mentioned as witnessing suffragette parades in Ely, immigrated from Finland and moved to Ely when she was 16 in 1914. She marched for women's rights to vote and was part of the Delphine Society, a study group for women to learn about art, music, and literature. How about one of the first 4 women mayors in the state of Minnesota, a year after white women received the right to vote? Mary Siren was Finnish and deemed very smart for a woman and was elected mayor of Winton, or the village president, in 1921. The 3 other towns that voted the first women mayors in Minnesota are Lillian Cox Galt of St. Peter, Florence J. Pierce of Goodhue, and Ida Sparks Clark of Cokato. Due to a lack of focus on women's roles in society, no images nor further information is available on Mary Siren, highlighting the importance of oral histories alongside the written word. When still in high school, Mary Sarcopato, later Erickson, began leading wilderness canoe trips, becoming the first woman to commercially guide in the area, and became a national sensation in 1932 with attention from the press. In 1937, when she graduated high school, her singing voice was recorded for the Library of Congress as a soloist of Finnish folk songs. She later went on to operate the Lodge of Whispering Pines on Big Lake with her husband until the mid 1950s. According to her obituary, she was deeply involved in Democratic politics, worked on numerous state and national campaigns, and attended the 1960 inaugural ball of President John F. Kennedy. Mary Tootloff Anderson and her husband John were owners of Echo Trail Resort on Burnside Lake in 1937. Not only were they among the earliest of resort owners in the area, Mary was the first Ojibwe woman to be in that position. Or these gals. These 6 women worked at Ely's Pioneer Mine in a male-dominated industry. There isn't much publicly available in terms of details about their jobs or lives other than doing secretarial work. However, I was able to find out through the grapevine from Sophie's daughter, Jan Hahn, from my mother in law, Katie Popish, that she was the secretary to the president of Oliver Mining Company in the 1940s, playing a pivotal role in recording testimonies from injured miners. Jan may have jokingly referred to this image as her mother's, quote, mugshot. Dorothy Molter had a life-changing trip to the Ely area in 1930 that led her to become the sole owner-proprietor of the Isle of Pines fly-in fishing resort on Knife Lake in 1948, a first in this region. As an unmarried, trained nurse, she became quite the novelty in the press as well. Although most remember her as the Rapier Lady, she is one of the main characters in the history of how the Boundary Waters came to be and left behind a long-lasting legacy, which is preserved at the Dorothy Molter Museum. Isabel Foote Koski became the first woman to be elected to Ely's school board in 1956, even though she, quote, wasn't from here. Barb Soderberg, who was one of the first female wildland firefighters in the U.S. Forest Service, was assigned to many Western fires during the years of high fire danger. After getting married in 1970, she and her husband Kurt became the first husband-wife wilderness ranger team in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. Deirdre Tomsich Dodge was born and raised in Ely, and after moving to Duluth, became the first woman to become a St. Louis County Commissioner in 1975. And Lolita Schnitzjes moved to Ely in 1972 and became very active in supporting community development efforts as a member of the Development Council and the New Business Committee. This ultimately led her to serving on the city council, and in 1998, almost 80 years after Winton, became the first woman mayor of Ely, serving 2 terms. That same year, the city of Winton elected its first all-female city government. This is by no means an exhaustive list of notable women, women's groups, or women's contributions from the Ely area. It is only a snippet of the rich and varied actions, impacts, and impressions that the women of this area have left behind. It is up to you to ensure that these and other historical figures are not forgotten and that our contemporaries are credited for their current and future pieces of the rich fabric that makes up our history here in the Northland and their contribution towards women's history. I had planned to end this program here. However, recent events have compelled me to continue a little bit more. The United States is at a crossroads in history. One direction leads to continued acknowledgement, learning, and a fight for equitable record keeping. The other leads back to the turn of the last century. Women's history, along with Indigenous, Black, and Hispanic history, is intentionally and quite literally being erased from publicly accessible federal websites. The Arlington National Cemetery website has been scrubbed of information and educational resources on prominent Indigenous, Black, Hispanic, and female service members buried there as part of a broader effort across the Defense Department to remove all references to diversity, equity, and inclusion from its online presence. Although history is told or written by people, and people have their own biases, values, and perspectives that inevitably influence how they select, interpret, and present historical events, collectively, our history helps us understand how past events shape our present and future, and provides context for current events, helping us make sense of the world. And it's our job to preserve it, all of it, and it's up to all of us to keep each other accountable. Thank you to my sources of imagery and information, including Kelsey Cook at the Ely Winton Historical Society, Mary Jo Caristee, and Ann Jackson from Winton. If you have any questions about the things covered in this show or would like to follow History Happy Hour, please find us on Facebook or Instagram. History Happy Hour is supported in kind by the Boathouse Brewpub, Ely's Heritage Preservation Commission, and the Dorothy Molter Museum, Boundary Waters Connect, the Ely Folk School, and Ely Trivia Night. Thanks for listening to this episode of History Happy Hour. Local history is our shared history, and your engagement with this topic keeps it alive. I especially hope that this program helps those of you who are not directly connected to it understand and appreciate it a bit more. Please join us next time to be inspired to learn more about our shared history.